She heard him the day she arrived. She'll cry at the sight of mud, the Duke said. City girls always do. She didn't cry. She rode out in a storm, saved his harvest, exposed a 30-year fraud in his own library, and made him fall in love with her before he noticed he'd started. The carriage turned off the post road at 2:30 on a Monday, and Cecily Fenwick had her first view of Calverton Park through a window streaked with rain. It was impressive. 3 stories of pale stone, symmetrical windows, a portico that managed to look both welcoming and forbidding depending on which way the light fell. At present, the light was being dragged sideways by the weather, and the house looked forbidding. The park stretched wide on both sides of the gravel drive, elm trees lining the approach in 2 long rows, stripped nearly bare by the October wind. "There it is," said Uncle George from the opposite seat, with the satisfaction of a man who had been here before and found it just as he remembered. "There it is," Cecily agreed. Beyond the eastern wing, a field ran toward what might, in better weather, have been a pleasant view of open farmland. At present it was a study in grey and brown. Cecily had been told that the country in autumn was not at its finest. She had been told this mostly by people who assumed she would find it intolerable, which had made her considerably more determined to find it agreeable. The carriage drew up. A groom appeared from the stables at a run. George gathered his papers. He had conducted the entire 4-hour journey in companionable silence while annotating something Cecily had not asked about, and descended. She followed. The rain had not lessened. She had worn her oldest boots on the theory that the country would ruin whatever she wore, and she would rather it ruin things she minded less. They were shown inside by a butler whose face communicated nothing but competence, into a hall that smelled of wood smoke and beeswax and, faintly, of dogs. The floor was stone, the ceilings high. Cecily was looking at the portraits when the butler paused to confer with a footman about the arrangement of their trunks, and in that pause she heard voices from the corridor immediately to her left, close, the doorway not 4 feet from where she stood. "Arrived then?" A man's voice, low, unhurried. "Just now." A woman's, lighter. "The niece came with him." A brief pause. "She'll cry at the sight of mud." Not cruel, something almost worse than cruel, which was simply certain. "City girls always do." The butler concluded his instruction and turned back to George. The corridor fell quiet. Cecily looked at the portrait nearest her, a man with dark eyes who appeared never to have cried at the sight of anything in his life. She filed the remark away in the precise manner of someone who intends to remember it and give it no further visible attention. Then she followed her uncle upstairs. The Duke of Dunmore received them in his study at 4 o'clock. He was tall, dark-haired, with eyes so dark a brown they read almost black in the firelight. He rose when they entered and gestured to the chairs. A footman set out the tea things. The study contained no ornament, one painting above the fireplace that appeared to be a map rather than a landscape. "Mr. Fenwick." He shook George's hand with the directness of a man who considers handshakes functional rather than ceremonial. "I am glad you made the journey." "Your Grace." George settled into his chair. "My niece, Miss Fenwick. She was good enough to accompany me. She has not been to this part of the county before." Rowan turned to Cecily. "Miss Fenwick." "Your Grace," she said. He held her gaze a half-second past courtesy. Then the meeting began. The business of the first meeting was preliminary. The real work was for tomorrow when the solicitors came. George talked, Rowan listened, and occasionally asked a question so precise it reorganized the conversation. Cecily drank her tea and observed. He did not address her again. Not rudely. He simply did not expect her to be relevant, and so he did not make her relevant. She was the ornament to the journey. Ornaments were not consulted on estate law. She understood. She was patient. Through the window, the field she had glimpsed from the carriage was now barely visible in the failing light. Cecily knew a fair amount about drainage and crop rotation and the problems of farmland in a wet autumn. She said none of it. There was a time for things. Beatrice found her before dinner. She opened her door with the energy of someone who had been waiting for an excuse. "Miss Fenwick, I am Beatrice. I thought I should find you before you got entirely lost. The East Wing is very confusing until you have been here a week." She was perhaps 20, with her brother's dark colouring and none of his reserve. She walked Cecily to the staircase with the easy authority of someone who had navigated these confusions since childhood. "Did the meeting go well?" she asked. "Productively, I think." "He takes everything seriously," Beatrice said without criticism, more the tone of someone who has made peace with a fact. It is a Dunmore quality. I observe something of that. Beatrice glanced sideways. You are being very diplomatic. I have only known him 2 hours. Most people have formed a complete opinion by then. Most people are impatient, Cecily said. Beatrice laughed. Unguarded, real. It echoed in the corridor and Cecily found herself smiling before she had decided to. Dinner was the 4 of them at one end of a table built for 20, which gave the evening a mildly absurd quality that Cecily suspected only she and Beatrice perceived. Rowan spoke when addressed and ate with focused attention. Beatrice carried the social weight of the table with cheerful competence. The conversation turned to flooding on the low fields. Rowan's gaze moved over Cecily in the way she was growing accustomed to, the particular non-expectation of a man who has already decided where the relevant information is. Miss Fenwick, Beatrice said with studied innocence, do you know much of drainage? Rowan is endlessly exercised about it. 2 pairs of eyes moved to her. The little, Cecily said. Flooding on a 3-year cycle usually suggests a blocked channel rather than a problem with the land itself, though it depends on the soil. The soil here is clay, Rowan said. Not a challenge, an offering to see what she would do with it. Then the water has nowhere to go quickly, she said. The channel is the problem. He looked at her. One long, level look. Then he turned back to George. We will need to walk the eastern boundary tomorrow before the solicitors arrive. He did not include Cecily in this plan. Beatrice refilled her wineglass with the quiet air of someone logging a point on a private scorecard. The morning came in clear and sharp. Cecily dressed early and went down to find Rowan already at the breakfast room window with a cup of coffee, looking at the east field. Miss Fenwick. He turned. Something moved across his face and was managed. I am usually first. So am I, she said, at home. She went to the sideboard. Outside the field was a luminous wet green. The east field, he said. You mentioned the channel last night. The channel is blocked or undersized. That is not an opinion, it is elementary drainage logic. Where did you learn drainage logic? My father's estate in Hampshire. We had the same problem. He resolved it eventually, though it took 3 years of arguing with his land agent. Who was right? My father, he usually was. Rowan set down his coffee. He did not return to the window. He sat at the nearer end of the table, which put him across from her rather than above her, and looked at her with an attention different from the evening before. Last night, he had been confirming what he already believed. This morning something had shifted, not in his manner, which remained even, but in the quality of his attention. The solicitors arrive at 10, he said. The walk to the eastern boundary is at 8. A pause. You are welcome to join us if you wish. Thank you, she said. I should like that. The eastern boundary ran along a low ridge before dropping to the strip of land that bore her family's name. Cecily walked it beside Rowan and her uncle, with the mild pleasure of someone glad to use their legs after 4 hours in a carriage. It was good land. The channel that ran along the lower edge of the east field was half blocked with 2 seasons of silt and fallen leaves. She could see the waterline on the bank from the last flood. She crouched at the channel edge. Footsteps behind her. She was aware without looking that Rowan had stopped. The blockage is 30 yards along, she said without preamble. Under that oak. You can see the silt line on the bank from here. My land agent said the channel was clear. He did not look at it in October after 3 days of rain. She stood, brushing mud from her fingers. 2 days of labor to clear it, possibly a widening where the roots have narrowed the bed, cheaper than another flood. Rowan was watching her with the expression of someone whose accounting has produced an unexpected figure. She's right, George said cheerfully from behind him. I can see the silt from here. Rowan said nothing. Cecily walked on toward the gap in the hedgerow where the Fenwick strip lay on the other side. The Fenwick strip was smaller than she had imagined. 4 acres, long and narrow, uncultivated. A waste. The soil looked decent, the exposure right for grain. Someone should be farming this, she said. Someone will be, Rowan said, coming to stand beside her, when the matter is settled. She looked at him. He was looking at the strip with the jaw-set quality of a man who has been considering a problem from every angle and has not yet found the one that resolves it. Do you believe you are right? She asked. About the ownership? Yes. My uncle believes the same, on the other side. I know. One of you is mistaken. He turned. His eyes were steady, not unkind. Yes, one of us is. It was not a concession, but it was the first honest thing he had said to her directly, and honesty was a currency she respected regardless of who was spending it. The storm came on the second Thursday. By midweek, the barometer in Rowan's hall was dropping in a way that made his housekeeper press her mouth thin. Thursday morning was deceptively still. At 11:30, it broke. Cecily was in the estate room with Beatrice, deep in a disagreement about a rounding error in the November fuel accounts, when the wind struck the window hard enough to rattle it in its frame. She went to it. At the far edge of the east field, something was wrong. The blockage she had identified on Tuesday had not been cleared. The rain was coming in horizontal sheets, and the low end of the field was already sheeted with standing water, banking up behind the silt obstruction, spreading sideways when it should be moving along. Another hour and the lower third of the field was gone, and below the boundary the Fenwick strip would receive all of it. "Where is your brother?" Cecily asked. "In the study with the land agent." Cecily was already moving to the door, reaching for her coat from the hook in the corridor. The old one, deep pockets, entirely unsuitable. "The lower field is flooding. If the strip goes under, the boundary dispute becomes considerably more complicated. Tell your brother and tell the head groom to send 2 men with spades to the east field." "You cannot go out in this." "I will meet them there." "Cecily." Beatrice stopped, as if surprised by her own use of the name. Cecily paused. Beatrice stood with an expression somewhere between alarm and admiration. 20 minutes, Cecily said. Then she went out into the storm. The rain was extraordinary, the kind with opinions that found the gap at your collar and exploited it without apology. The gravel drive ran with water. By the time Cecily crossed the park and reached the Eastfield gate, her hair was down from its pins and her coat soaked through at the shoulders. She did not especially mind. She had been wet before. The standing water was already ankle-deep at the low end, a flat grey sheet that reflected the storm sky. The blockage was visible 50 yards along, the water banking behind the silt and root, spreading sideways. 2 of Rowan's men arrived at a run with spades. Cecily pointed without preamble. "There, under the oak root at the narrow point. Clear the silt 3 yards back on the near side. The pressure will do the rest. Work from the water's edge inward. Don't step in the middle, or you'll collapse what structure is left." They exchanged a look. "Miss Fenwick sent word from the house," one said, half a question. "I am Miss Fenwick. Work quickly." They worked quickly. She stood at the field edge, calling instructions through the rain. Deeper at the root, further right, leave the larger stones, and was therefore facing away from the gate when Rowan arrived. She became aware of him because the men glanced up, their attention shifting. She turned. He was on horseback, a groom behind him on a second horse. He took in the channel, the men's position, the waterline, the same swift inventory he brought to everything, and then he looked at her. She was soaked entirely through, hair plastered to her face, mud on her coat and almost certainly on her face. She met his eyes. He dismounted, handing his reins to the groom. "The route is the problem," she said, because the situation required it. "Once they clear the near side, it should move." He walked to the channel edge and crouched where she had crouched on Tuesday, looking at the blockage with the focused attention he brought to things worth his time. "The agent said it was clear." "The agent was wrong." "She's moving," one of the men said. The water broke through, a trickle around the root, then faster as pressure found its path. The banked water began to level and move. Crisis done. Rowan stood. He looked at the field. Then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said, "not Miss Fenwick, no qualification." "The channel needs proper clearing when the rain stops," she said. "This will hold for now." He nodded. He was looking at her in the recalculating way, but differently from before. Less like revising a figure down, and more like finding a column he had not accounted for. "You will take cold," he said. "I have not taken cold in 24 years. Something moved at the corner of his mouth, the careful cousin of a smile. "That is an unusual certainty." "I am an empiricist," she said. He turned to speak to his men. The moment closed, as moments do, back into the ordinary business of the day. But it had happened, and nothing about the eastern field, or the way she had said, "Your Grace," with a small wall behind it, was quite the same as before. "That evening, Beatrice by the fire, he told me you directed his men." "Someone had to." "He came to dinner and spoke to your uncle about the prospects for winter wheat. He has not once asked me about winter wheat." Beatrice looked at her steadily. "He sent 2 men to clear the channel properly this morning. It is done." He was always going to clear it eventually. Before you mentioned it, he had an agent telling him it was fine. Beatrice set down her book. You are very deliberate, Miss Fenwick. I have only been here a fortnight. Yes, Beatrice said. I am aware of how long you have been here. She picked the book back up in the manner of someone who has said the thing they meant to say. The days that followed settled into a pattern. George and the solicitors met in the mornings. In the afternoons the weather cleared to a cool, bright October, and Beatrice walked with Cecily, and Rowan had taken to appearing on these walks with the studied casualness of a man who happened to be going in the same direction. He asked about Hampshire, the soil, the crops, how her father had managed. She answered without decoration, and he listened with the quality of attention he reserved for things worth his time. She told him about the flooding on the western fields, the 3 years of argument with the land agent, what her father had eventually done to resolve it. Rowan listened with the expression she was beginning to recognize, not quite a smile, but the thing that lived in its neighborhood. He went himself, Rowan said, to look at the problem. He always went himself. He said no agent knew the land the way the man who owned it did. A pause. They were on the ridge above the east field. Below, the cleared channel ran properly, the last of the standing water long drained. My father managed from the house, Rowan said. Strong opinions about the land. Very incomplete knowledge of it. Is that why you go yourself? Partly. They stood and looked at the field and, beyond the hedgerow, the uncultivated length of the Fenwick strip. It should be grain, she said. The soil is right and the exposure is good. 3 acres and 3 roods, he said, correcting her. 3 acres and 3 roods, she agreed. The corner of his mouth moved. She was beginning to understand that this was its full extent, that for Rowan this was what most men would accomplish with considerably more expression. She found, to her mild interest, that she preferred it. The evening she found him in the library, she had come to return the survey maps. She had borrowed them 4 days ago on a question that had been forming since she first looked at the 1791 counter-survey, and found the baseline did not agree with the 1783 original by any margin that instrument error could explain. She had said nothing about this to anyone. She was replacing the last map on its shelf when she heard the fire settle, and found Rowan in the armchair, a book open on his knee that he had clearly not been reading. Miss Fenwick, not startled. Your Grace, I was returning the maps. I did not know you were here. You have had them 4 days. Yes. Why? She turned to face him properly. The 1791 survey. He was still. The baseline differs from the 1783 survey by more than instrument error can explain. I cannot tell you definitively which is correct, but the 1791 was conducted by your estate's own man, and the discrepancy conveniently shifts the boundary 3 roods in your favor. The fire settled. The room was quiet. You are telling me, he said slowly, that my counter-survey may have been conducted in bad faith. I am telling you what the maps show. The conclusion is yours. He stood, not in agitation, simply because he thought better on his feet, and moved to the window. She waited. Why are you telling me this, he said. It serves your uncle's case. It serves the truth, which I find I prefer. He turned. His face was controlled, but something behind it was working. You should have taken this to your uncle's solicitor. I found it in your library, using your maps, lent to me in good faith. He looked at her. Not the confirming look of the first day, but something different. A man encountering something he had not accounted for and choosing to see it clearly. Cecily, he said. She went still. He said it quietly, without apparent consciousness of having departed from Miss Fenwick, simply her name. Then he heard himself, and something moved through his expression, not apology, not embarrassment, recalibration. Miss Fenwick, he said correctly, thank you. She nodded. She picked up her candle. At the door she stopped. The 1783 survey uses the old oak at the southern end of the strip as its reference point. The oak is still there. It might be worth measuring from it again. She left him in the firelight with that, and did not look back. The letter from London arrived on a Monday. George read it at breakfast with the stillness of a man absorbing something he had not expected. He folded it along its original creases and set it beside his plate. There is news from Hartley. The Dunmore estate has applied to the Court of Chancery. Cecily set down her cup. Filed a fortnight ago, George said. We were not notified. The court date is the 14th of November. 3 weeks. On what grounds? Adverse possession combined with the 1791 survey. 30 years of uncontested occupation. His voice was even. The application was filed by Dunmore's London solicitor without informing the local man, which is why we are only hearing now. Cecily looked at the window. Rowan was somewhere in this house, in his study or his fields, either aware of this or not. She considered what she had observed of him over 3 weeks. The good faith across every negotiation, the admission in the library, the channel cleared the morning after she mentioned it. "Does he know?" she asked. "That is what I intend to find out." He did not know. Beatrice's account, delivered to Cecily in the corridor 20 minutes after George went into the study. He read the letter twice. He went to his desk and found a letter from his London solicitor that he had not opened. He opened it in front of your uncle. A pause. The room got very quiet. He told your uncle he had no knowledge of the Chancery application and asked for until this afternoon. Cecily stood in the corridor and looked out at the east field. "Do you believe him?" Beatrice asked. "Yes," Cecily said without hesitation. "So do I, which does not make it simpler." Beatrice was quiet a moment. To withdraw the application, he would have to formally abandon the adverse possession claim. The boundary question remains open, but he would be conceding the ground his London man built the case on. He would have to choose, Cecily said, between his position and what he now knows. He came to find her in the walled garden that afternoon. He came without his coat, which told her everything. He sat on the bench, not at the far end, but close enough that they were simply 2 people on a bench, and looked at the rosemary and the bare fig tree against the south wall. "I did not authorize the Chancery application," he said. "Hartwell acted on a general instruction I gave 18 months ago to use all available means to resolve the boundary question. He interpreted it broadly." "I believe you," Cecily said. He turned to look at her. "Without requiring more?" "Your Grace, I have spent 3 weeks watching you conduct every negotiation in good faith. I watched your face when my uncle showed you that letter this morning, through a window, which I acknowledge was not my finest hour." The careful cousin of a smile arrived, and for the first time stayed. "You watched through a window." "Briefly, I reserve the right to the full account." It passed. Something warmer remained, a slight easing of his jaw, the quality of a man permitted to set something down. "Hartwell must be instructed to withdraw," he said. "I have already written to him. The application will be abandoned." A pause. "That will not resolve the boundary question." "No, but it removes the court case as a reason." She waited. "As a reason not to settle this properly." He looked at her steadily. "I want to measure from the oak, both surveys, both solicitors, both families present. If the 1783 survey is correct, the strip belongs to your uncle. And if it is not? Then we find out what is actually true and settle accordingly." She heard the cost of it beneath the plainness. 30 years of his family's position, the certainty he had organized himself around, the dispossession of an expectation he had inherited with the dukedom. "Your Grace," she said, and heard in her own voice that the small wall was gone. It had come down somewhere in the past 3 weeks without announcement, and she was only just noticing. "That is the right thing to do." He looked at her. "I should have done it sooner." She did not tell him it was all right. She acknowledged it with a nod, and they sat in the kitchen garden with the rosemary moving in the breeze and the fig tree patient against the south wall, and said very little, and it was enough. When she rose to go, he stood when she stood. For a moment he seemed on the verge of something held in careful reserve. His eyes were direct and dark and entirely serious. "Then, the measuring party should go out Thursday morning if the weather holds." "Thursday would be good," she said. She walked the length of the east corridor with her book under her arm, aware, with a precision she found inconvenient, that she was warm from the collar to the hem of her coat, and the afternoon was not the reason. The oak had been standing at the southern end of the Fenwick strip for 140 years. It was enormous. 3 men could not have circled its trunk, and its roots ran on both sides of the hedgerow as if it had declined, in its century and a half, to acknowledge the dispute at all. They came out in a party of 7 on a frost-sharp morning. Rowan, his estate manager, and a groom, Cecily, George, and both solicitors. Beatrice had announced at breakfast that she was coming, and received a look from her brother that was not quite an objection. The solicitors set up their instruments with the mutual wariness of chess players regarding an opponent's opening move. Cecily stood beside George and was aware, against her preference, of exactly where Rowan stood at all times in the field. Not looking at him directly, simply knowing where the heat was. The measurement took the better part of 2 hours. She watched them run their lines from the Oaks Centre, consult the 1783 survey, record their figures. She did the arithmetic in her head before they read it aloud. Cartwright read first, then Dalby within 3 inches of each other. The boundary was where the 1783 survey said it was. The Fenwick strip was George Fenwick's land. George's face moved through controlled relief and vindication. He turned to Rowan and extended his hand. Rowan shook it. "Your Grace," George said, "I am grateful for your willingness to resolve this properly." "It was long past time," Rowan said. He looked across at Cecily. "We are both of us grateful, I think, to Miss Fenwick." "We are," George agreed with the mildly surprised air of a man who has arrived at a conclusion his niece reached some weeks ago. Beatrice at Cecily's shoulder said nothing. Her stillness had the quality of someone managing not to say something that would have been deeply satisfying to say. Cecily looked back at Rowan. Across the cold morning air, the frost, the enormous indifferent oak, the arithmetic of the past 3 weeks. She could see it clearly now. What had been building under all the careful management. Not resolved, not finished. Something that had nothing to do with the Fenwick strip and everything to do with 2 people who had begun by looking at the same things and had found somewhere between the drainage ditch and the library and the kitchen garden bench that they were no longer looking in the same direction but at each other. She held his gaze. He held hers. The frost sat on the grass and the oak stood in its ancient, unimpressed way, and neither of them looked away first. The solicitors left on Friday. Cartwright and Dalby departed in separate carriages, with the mutual relief of men who have concluded a professional engagement without openly disliking each other, which was the best outcome either had hoped for. The formal acknowledgement of the boundary was drafted, signed, and dispatched to London. The Fenwick strip had an owner. The dispute that had occupied 2 families for 30 years was, on paper, finished. What remained was not on paper. George announced at dinner that he would begin preparations to leave on Monday. He said it with the satisfaction of a man whose work is done. He would return to London, brief Hartley, consider what to do with 4 acres of farmland in a county he did not live in. He looked cheerful. He looked like a man going home. Cecily looked at her plate. Beatrice looked at Rowan. Rowan looked at nothing in particular, with the focused attention of someone concentrating very hard on not concentrating on anything. "Monday," Beatrice said. "That is very soon." "The business is concluded," George said pleasantly. "There is no reason to impose further on His Grace's hospitality." "You are not imposing," Rowan said. His voice was entirely even. "You are very kind, but London calls." George turned to Cecily with the comfortable assumption of a man who has not been paying close attention to the room. "You will be glad to be home, I think." Cecily looked up. Across the table, Rowan was looking at her. Not the assessment from the first day, something that had been finding its shape for 3 weeks and had quite recently found it. "Yes," she said, and could not quite make it sound true. Saturday morning was pewter-coloured, low cloud pressing the park flat. Cecily was in the estate room. She had returned to the fuel accounts, partly from genuine interest in the rounding error, and partly because she was not yet ready to be in London, when Rowan appeared in the doorway. He stood for a moment at the threshold, with the quality of a man who has made a decision, and arrived before he has quite decided what to do with it. "Miss Fenwick." "Your Grace." He came in. He did not sit. He moved to the window adjacent to hers and looked out at the park, and she waited, because she had learned that his silences were not empty. "I owe you a candid conversation," he said. "Do you?" "I said something the day you arrived that I believe you heard." He was looking at the park. "I said you would cry at the sight of mud." Cecily set down her pen. "I said it to Beatrice," he continued. "I said it as though it could not possibly matter whether you heard. Which is rather different from not knowing I might," she said. "It assumes the question is irrelevant." "Yes," he accepted this without deflection. "That is more accurate. You assumed I was ornamental and therefore irrelevant. It was not malice. It was something more ordinary than malice, an expectation so fixed you did not trouble to examine it." He held what she had said in the way he held everything, with the serious attention of a man who thinks accuracy matters more than comfort. "I was wrong," he said. "I know. I knew it before the storm." He stopped, started again. "I knew it on the ridge the first morning when you showed me the channel. I simply continued." "You had been wrong about my family for 30 years," she said. You were not ready to be wrong about me as well. It seemed too much to revise at once. He looked at her directly. That is a generous account of it. It is an accurate one. I am not being generous. A pause. Outside, the park sat grey and still. My family's position on the strip, he said, was built on a survey conducted in bad faith by my own estate's man, which means I have been certain for 30 years about something that cannot support the weight of that certainty. Yes. And you found it in a library in 4 days. 3, she said, the careful cousin of a smile. 3. The room was quiet. The estate account book lay open on the table between them, the rounding error still unsolved. I heard what you said on the day I arrived, Cecily said, and I put it away and decided not to let it matter yet, because you had not had the opportunity to be right about me, and it seemed unfair to judge a man on what he says about someone he has not met. That was more patience than I deserved. It was practicality. I was going to be here for several weeks regardless. His mouth moved. She watched it. Cecily, he said. Not Miss Fenwick, not the accidental slip from the library, quickly corrected. Deliberate, quiet. Her name in his voice as though he had decided he had the right to it. She felt it land. I did not come here to unravel your boundary dispute, she said. Her voice was level. She was rather proud of that. I know what you came here for. He took a step, not toward her exactly, more as if the room had contracted and he was simply accounting for it. You came with your uncle because he required company, and you were curious about the country. You stayed because there were problems that wanted solving, and you are constitutionally incapable of leaving a problem alone. That is not a particularly romantic characterization. No, he said. It is not. He looked at her with the full, undivided force of his attention. Nothing managed. You told me the truth about the 1791 survey when you had no obligation to. You showed me the channel the morning after you arrived and waited while I failed to act on it, and did not mention it again until a storm made it urgent. You have spoken your mind to me from the first evening in a way that no one here does, because they are accustomed to the dukedom, and you are not. He paused. I find that I have become very accustomed to you, he said. Cecily looked at him for a long moment. You find it convenient, she said, having someone who tells you the truth. I find it... He stopped, and then something shifted in his face at the last layer of careful management, and what was underneath was simple and unguarded and very clear. I find it necessary. I find you necessary. I am aware that is a significant statement to make to a woman who is leaving on Monday. The rain began, soft and steady against the window, not the storm of last week, but the ordinary kind, the kind that intends to last the afternoon. Cecily looked at the window. Then she looked at him. Rowan, she said. His name, deliberate, hers to use. He went very still. I heard what you said about me the day I arrived, she said, and I decided to let you be wrong because you had not yet had the opportunity to be right. That is not a patience I extend to everyone. She held his gaze. I am telling you this so that you understand the decision was made before the storm, before the library, before the walled garden. It was made in the corridor on the first day, while I was looking at a portrait of your grandfather. He crossed the room. She had thought in the weeks of proximity and dry exchange, and the careful accumulation of small moments, that she understood the full force of his attention. She understood now that she had been receiving a portion of it. What arrived now was the whole of it, close and direct and entirely serious. I am going to ask you to stay, he said. Not as your uncle's companion, not because there are fields that want inspecting. I am asking you to stay because I intend to court you properly, and I cannot do that if you are in London. You could write letters. I write very poor letters. I have nothing to say on paper that I cannot say better in person. That is fortunate, she said, since you are in person at present. The careful cousin of a smile arrived and for the first time became the actual thing, full and unguarded. It changed his face considerably. Stay, he said, please. Cecily looked at him. The dark eyes, the earnest, undisguised quality of him, stripped of the dukedom's manner, simply a man standing in a grey afternoon asking plainly. I will speak to my uncle, she said. I will speak to your uncle. You will not. He will be alarmed if you speak to him before I do. He does not know. Does he not? He has been very occupied with the survey. Beatrice has been very occupied with the survey, he said, in a way that I now suspect was not entirely about the survey. Cecily thought of wine glasses refilled and pointed questions about the walled garden bench, and a woman managing not to say something immensely satisfying. No, she agreed, probably not. He was still close. The rain continued against the window, soft and without agenda. "I will speak to George this evening," she said. He nodded. He did not move back. She was aware of the warmth of him, the steadiness and the particular quality of a space that two people occupy when neither of them is in any hurry to leave it. "Rowan," she said again, testing it, hers. "Cecily," he said, his. Outside, the park sat in its pewter afternoon, perfectly indifferent to both of them. She found George in the small sitting room off the east corridor before dinner. Papers spread around him, in the comfortable chaos of a concluded task. He looked up when she came in with the mild pleasure of a man who likes company. She sat opposite him and told him plainly. He listened. When she finished, he was quiet a moment. He looked at his papers. He looked at her. "His Grace," he said. "Yes. The Duke of Dunmore." "I am aware of the title, Uncle." "He said this to you directly?" "He did." George set down his pen. He looked briefly at the ceiling in the way of a man performing a private calculation. Then he looked at her with the direct, unsentimental affection of someone who has known her a long time and is choosing his words with care. "So your father," he said, "believed for 30 years that the Dunmore family had taken Fenwick land by a fraudulent survey. The oak resolved that. The oak resolved the land. It has not resolved 30 years of feeling." He paused. "What does she say?" Cecily looked at her uncle, who had never in her life asked her a sentimental question, and was asking one now with the precision of a man who wanted an accurate answer. "She says," Cecily said, "that she would like very much to stay." George was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his pen. "I will delay our departure by a fortnight," he said, "to allow the matter to be conducted with appropriate form." "That is very good of you." "It is entirely self-interested. I have no wish to be the man who took you back to London prematurely and had to explain it to your mother." He made a note on the paper before him, a note about something entirely unrelated, she suspected. "His Grace will be formal about it." "He is formal about everything." "Good," said George. "I find I prefer that in the circumstances." Rowan was formal about it. He called on George the following morning privately, while Cecily and Beatrice walked the park in the thin November beginning light. When they returned, George had the look of a man who has been addressed correctly and found the experience satisfactory. Rowan had the look of a man who has crossed a threshold and intends to stay on the new side of it. Beatrice walked with Cecily to the window at the end of the east corridor and was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I have been trying to arrange this for 2 weeks." "I know," Cecily said. "You knew?" "The wineglass, the walled garden bench question, the drainage inquiry at dinner." Beatrice was quiet. Then she laughed, the real unguarded laugh Cecily had first heard in this same corridor 4 weeks ago. "I was not subtle." "You were perfectly subtle. You were simply visible to me." Beatrice looked at her with the frank, clear-eyed affection she had offered from almost the first day. "I want you to stay," she said, "not because of Rowan, because of you." "I know that too," Cecily said. Beatrice squeezed her hand once, briefly, then turned and went back along the corridor. Cecily stayed at the window and looked out at the elm trees, bare now, the park in its lean November aspect, grey and clear and entirely itself. She had come here as a companion to her uncle. She was not going home on Monday. The courtship properly conducted lasted 6 weeks. George remained at Calverton Park for a fortnight, long enough to observe the proceedings, with the approval of a man who had negotiated a boundary dispute and acquired a satisfactory outcome on both fronts. When he finally departed for London in mid-November, he shook Rowan's hand at some length and kissed Cecily's cheek and said, with the brisk practicality of someone who has done what he came to do, "I will write to your mother." "Please do not tell her everything at once," Cecily said. "I will tell her the relevant parts in the correct order," George said, which was not quite the same thing, and she knew better than to press him. His departure left Cecily at Calverton Park as Beatrice's guest, a necessary propriety that Beatrice managed with cheerful competence, ensuring that Cecily's presence in the household was at all times correct. Rowan courted her with the same focused attention he brought to everything he considered worth his time, which was to say, thoroughly, and without affectation, and with a dry precision she found more appealing than any amount of performance would have been. He walked with her daily, Not the studied casualness of the early weeks, but openly. The two of them on the ridge above the east field, or through the kitchen garden, or along the lane that ran past the Fenwick strip boundary, talking about everything and nothing in the easy way of two people who have already been honest with each other about what matters. He told her about the dukedom as he had inherited it, the debt his father had left, the 2 years of hard management to bring the estate to its current order. He told it without self-pity or false modesty. She told him about London, the particular social economy of a family with a good name and a modest income, the way she had learned to navigate a room by watching her mother work one. He listened with his whole attention, as he always did. "You were not unhappy there," he said. Not a question. "No, but I was not." She looked at the fields. The Fenwick strip was visible from here, the hedgerow bright with the last of the season's colour. "I was useful in small ways. Here I am useful in large ones." He was quiet for a moment. "That is not the only reason I hope you will stay." "I know," she said, "but it is not a small thing to feel one's usefulness at full scale." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I suppose it is not." She had been thinking about the strip since the morning the oak resolved its ownership, thinking about what happened to 4 acres of good farmland once it belonged to a man who lived in London and had no agricultural interest in it. Under coverture, the matter would resolve itself on her marriage. If she married Rowan, the management of Fenwick land would be a question between 2 households joined, and George was already inclined, she suspected, to let practical sense govern it. She had said nothing of this to Rowan. It was not yet the moment for it. "The strip should be turned over in spring," she said. "Barley, if your uncle will agree to let it. The soil is right and the exposure is good." "I shall write to Mr. Fenwick about it," Rowan said with a precision that told her he had already been thinking along the same lines and had been waiting to see if she would raise it. She had. He noted it. Neither of them made more of it than that. He had been trying, he told her later, to identify the correct moment for 3 days. He had planned the library, a fire, composure, the right words arranged in the right order. He abandoned this plan on a Tuesday morning because they were on the lane past the Fenwick strip and the light was exactly right and he had run out of patience with planning. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to face him on the lane with the bare hedgerow on one side and the cold blue sky on the other. "I have something to say," he said, "and I want to be clear before I begin that it is a proposal, so that you know where we are going." "I appreciate the preparation," she said. "Cecily." He took her hands. His were warm, which she had not expected from a November lane. "I was wrong about you before I met you, and wrong about you for the first week after I met you, and you let me be wrong without making me pay for it, which I did not deserve. You told me the truth about the survey at no advantage to yourself because it was the truth. You went out in a storm to save my field, not to prove a point, but because the thing needed doing. You sat with me in the kitchen garden and told me I was doing the right thing in a voice that made me certain I could do it." He held her hands and did not look away. "You have made this house feel like a place where someone actual lives," he said. "I did not know it was missing that until you were in it. I know it now, and I find I am not willing to go back to not knowing it." Cecily looked at him on the November lane and thought about a corridor, a portrait, and a remark she had put away and decided not to let matter. "You were very certain," she said, "that I would cry at the sight of mud." He held her gaze. "I was wrong about that too." "You corrected it the same way you corrected the survey question," she said. "When the evidence was clear, you changed. That is not nothing. That is a very empirical account of why someone should accept a proposal." "I am an empiricist," she said. "The evidence is quite good." Something bright moved through his eyes. "Is that a yes?" "That is a yes, Rowan." He pulled her hands toward him, and she stepped forward on the November lane, and he kissed her. It was unhurried. There was no reason to hurry. The lane was empty, and the sky was wide, and the elm trees stood in their bare November patience, and the kiss was the kind that knows it has time, warm and certain, and arrived at last at exactly the right moment, which had turned out to be a lane in November with mud on both their boots, which was entirely in keeping with the way everything between them had gone. When they separated, she was aware of his hands still holding hers, and the slight unevenness of his breathing, and the expression on his face, the full, unguarded version of everything she had been cataloguing in smaller portions for 6 weeks. "I should speak to your uncle," he said. "You spoke to my uncle." "That was preliminary. This is definitive. I will write to him today." "He will be pleased," she said. "He liked you before I did." "Before?" "Before I admitted it," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. The lane was cold and bright. "Come," she said, and they walked back to Calverton Park together, and neither of them spoke, and it was better that way. Rowan wrote to George that afternoon. George's reply arrived 4 days later. 2 sentences, both of them straightforward, the second of which directed Rowan to a London solicitor for the settlement discussions. It was, Cecily thought, the most George-like letter she had ever had reported to her. Her mother's letter, which arrived the same day, was considerably longer, and covered a range of topics including the unexpectedness of the outcome, the great distance from London, and several pointed observations about the importance of a woman knowing her own mind before she made it up. The letter concluded with 6 lines of genuine warmth that made Cecily sit quietly in the estate room for a moment before she went to find Beatrice. Beatrice read the letter without being asked to. She handed it back. "Your mother," she said, "is a sensible woman." "She is." "She will like Rowan." "Eventually," Cecily said. "Once he has looked at her in that way 3 or 4 times and she has understood that it means he is listening." Beatrice smiled. "Yes, that took me a full season." The settlement discussions were handled between solicitors over the following weeks, conducted with the efficiency of a process that has the full goodwill of all parties and the practical advantage of a bride who has spent 3 weeks reviewing estate accounts and knows precisely what is in them. The terms were agreed before Christmas. The banns were called in December. They married in January. The ceremony was at the village church, which was small and old, and had the quality of a building that has witnessed enough human occasion to be entirely unimpressed by one more. Beatrice stood beside Cecily. George, who had returned from London for the occasion with Cecily's mother and younger sister in tow, brought her down the aisle with the contained satisfaction of a man who has handled a complicated matter well and is not going to be modest about it. Cecily wore blue. The ceremony was cold, as January ceremonies always are, and brief as she had asked it to be, and entirely itself. At the altar, Rowan turned when she came down the aisle, and the controls slipped for one unguarded moment, and she saw everything, clearly, entirely, all at once. She gave him a look that said, "I see you." He gave one back that said, "I know." The vows were old, and the stone was cold, and the vicar conducted proceedings with the quiet authority of a man who has said these words many times and knows their weight. When it was done, Rowan took her hand and did not let it go, which she found, in retrospect, the most characteristic thing he had done. The ring fit exactly, as if it had been made with some prescience of her hand. The wedding breakfast at Calverton Park was warm, and nothing like a performance. George was in excellent form. Beatrice had organized the flowers, white, spare, exactly right. Colonel Marsh, their neighbor, gave a toast that was long and kind and mostly accurate. Cecily's mother looked around the dining room with the expression of a woman reassessing a situation in real time and arriving gradually at the conclusion that it was better than she had feared. Cecily sat at the head of the table that had seated 20, and now nearly did. She looked at Rowan beside her. He looked at her. Under the table his hand found hers and stayed there. She thought about a carriage turning off the post road in October rain, and a house that had looked forbidding. She thought about a corridor and a remark put away, and a channel not cleared, and a storm that had required going out in, and a library at 9 in the evening, and an oak tree that had known perfectly well where the boundary was. 5 months. She had come here for 3 weeks. "What are you thinking?" he said, quiet enough that only she heard. "Drainage," she said. He looked at her with the full unguarded version, the one she had earned and now had, and would have for the rest of her life. "Of course you are," he said. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Down the table, Beatrice was laughing at something George had said, and the candles were lit, and the house that had looked forbidding from a rain-streaked window in October was warm to the walls. Calverton Park, 3 years later, April. The girl came in from the garden with mud to her knees and an expression of complete satisfaction. She was 2.5, which was old enough to have strong opinions about the garden, and not old enough to have learned that strong opinions required justification. She stood in the doorway of the estate room and looked at her mother with the confidence of someone who has achieved exactly what she set out to achieve and expects this to be noted. "Eleanor," Cecily said. "Mud," Eleanor said by way of explanation and held out her hands. "I can see that." Cecily rose from the desk. The estate room had been hers since the November after the wedding, when Rowan had said simply that it made more sense for her to use it since she used it more, and crouched before her daughter. Eleanor's boots were a lost cause, her coat was reparable, her face was frankly exhilarated. "Did you fall?" Cecily asked. "No." A pause for accuracy. "A little." "Did you cry?" Eleanor looked at her mother with the expression of someone for whom this question does not compute. "No." "Good girl," Cecily said. She was cleaning Eleanor's hands with the cloth from the desk, a sacrifice she noted and did not mourn, when footsteps sounded in the corridor and Rowan appeared in the doorway. He stopped. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Cecily. He looked at the mud, which was extensive. "She fell," Cecily said. "A little," Eleanor confirmed. Rowan crouched beside his daughter and inspected the situation with the attention he brought to channel blockages and boundary surveys and every other thing requiring honest assessment. He looked at the small scrape on her palm. "Does it hurt?" he asked. Eleanor considered this seriously. "A bit, but not a crying bit." "No," he agreed. "I did not think so." He stood. He looked at Cecily over Eleanor's head with the expression she knew completely now. 3 years of mornings and evenings, and November lanes, and the ordinary accumulation of a life shared. The fond, level, entirely unmanaged look of a man who finds the room he is in to be exactly where he wants to be. "Haverford says the barley on the strip is coming up well," he said. "I told him it would. The exposure is right. You told me that in October of the year before last. You required some time." "I consistently require time," he said. "You have noted this before." "Several times." He reached into his coat and produced a letter. "From Marsh. The Collins farm on the northern boundary is coming available. He thought we might be interested in the grazing rights." She took it, read it quickly. "The northern field has a drainage problem." "I know." "The same solution as the east field. A channel cleared, probably widened." "I know," he said, and his voice had that quality, quiet and warm and with everything under it. "I thought you might like to look at it." Cecily looked at her husband on an April morning, in the estate room that was hers, in the house that had looked forbidding from a carriage window 3.5 years ago, and thought about everything that had happened between October rain and April sun, the channel and the storm and the library and the oak, and a November lane and a ring that had fit as if it had been waiting. "Yes," she said, "I should like that very much." He crossed the room and kissed her, briefly and without ceremony, in the matter-of-fact way of a man who has been doing this for 3 years and intends to continue indefinitely. She leaned into it. Eleanor, below them, said, "Mamma," with the authoritative tone of someone who feels their narrative relevance is being neglected. They separated. Rowan picked up Eleanor, who transferred a quantity of garden mud to his coat with the unapologetic ease of someone who knows she will be forgiven. "Rowan," Cecily said. He turned. She held up the letter. "I'm going to need the survey maps." He looked at her, all of it, the full unguarded version, 3 years on and no smaller for it. "They are on the shelf where you left them," he said. "Where they always are." She smiled. He smiled back, the real one, full and uncontained, not the careful cousin. Eleanor announced that she wanted to go back to the garden. "In a moment," Rowan told her. "Now," Eleanor said, with the serene certainty of someone who has never once cried at the sight of mud and sees no reason to start. Cecily caught his eye over their daughter's head. He caught hers. Outside, April was at its best. The park green and bright, the elm trees in their first new leaf, the Fenwick strip beyond the hedgerow showing the bright green of barley coming up in the right soil with the right exposure, exactly as she had said it would. She went to find the maps. The estate room door stood open behind her. The house was warm and full and entirely itself.
Don't forget to like and subscribe, or at least leave a comment if you enjoyed the story.